This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. Over the next hour or so, we're going to be running through all the key stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick update on the market. So we're smack in the middle of earnings season at the moment. Safaricom is releasing its half-year numbers tomorrow morning before the East African markets open. The firm share price peaked around the middle of August. It's down about 3% since then. Now, that decline has accelerated, especially from late October, in part due to concerns about Safaricom's operations, nascent operations, I should point out, in Ethiopia, where there's a civil war raging in the country's north. At today's close, NSE 20 is about 3.5% higher on a year-to-date basis, continuing its decline, though, from the year's peak in early September. Here's what's coming up tonight. South Africa's finance minister prepares to deliver his first mid-term budget. We'll have a preview. Authorities in Zimbabwe are considering turning to Bitcoin to solve the country's currency crisis. And EU finance ministers meet to discuss inflation and rising energy costs. And you'll certainly be hearing about those energy costs a little later in the programme. Our starting point of this hour, however, is a conflict in Ethiopia. The African Union is calling for an immediate ceasefire and cessation of hostilities in Ethiopia. It's urging the federal government and all other relevant parties, specifically TPLF, to engage in meaningful and genuine dialogue. The AU Peace and Security Council convened an emergency session to discuss an update to the conflict in Ethiopia's north. Here's CGTN's Coletta Njohi with this update from Addis Ababa.
The African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa, former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, has presented a report to the African Union Peace and Security Council on the conflict in Ethiopia. He says he has met with both Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the leadership of the Tigray People's Liberation Front to push for a peaceful reconciliation to the protracted conflict in the country's north. And he is asking the international community to rally behind the AU-led process to strengthen the peacemaking efforts. The AU Peace and Security Council says there will be no military solution to this crisis and has condemned all forms of hate speech and incitement to hatred, violence and discrimination. The continental body is concerned that the ongoing conflict continues to worsen an already dire humanitarian situation in the country's north. The United Nations has estimated that 7 million people have been forced to depend on humanitarian assistance for slightly over a year. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian Air Force has targeted new areas in the north that it claims are training grounds and logistics centers for the TPLF. Coletta Njohi, CGTN News, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Right, and of course, the conflict in Ethiopia is a story we're very, very keen on, and we're following up on it in detail on this program. Let's head over to Addis Ababa. Girum Chala now joins us live from that particular city. So, Girum, when we spoke last week, TPLF forces are reported to have captured the towns of Dessie and Kombolcha, about 400 odd kilometers from Addis Ababa. How has the front changed since then?
Roman, I can only report to you back saying that the war has only intensified over the last few days, and it has continued in the two important cities of Kombolcha and Dessie. You know that these cities are very strategic. They are one closer to the capital, Addis Ababa. Two, this is where TPLF has a stronghold at the moment, and they are promising a coalition with the Oromo Liberation Army, which has been operating in the western Oromia part of the country, and now is jointly operating with the TPLF. And both are promising to march to the capital, Addis Ababa. That's when the entire world started panicking about this particular situation. The United States Embassy and others are also saying that people. So, unfortunately, like I said, war has continued. The Ethiopian National Defense Force are saying that they are gaining ground. They have at least contained the TPLF force in those two particular places. Perhaps chasing them away is also one story that we cannot verify at the moment, but we have heard about it. So generally speaking, Ramah, war has really continued.
Has there been any progress in the mediation efforts that is being carried out now by the special envoys, not just from the African Union, but also from the United States?
Light at the end of it is experts and analysts are saying, considering the efforts of former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, special envoy for the Eastern Africa region. He's been here in town for the last few days in the country as well. At the same time, he spoke to the Prime Minister about possible ways of starting a roundtable discussion to peacefully resolve the more than 1 year-old war, which claimed thousands of lives and millions have been evicted from their homes, and still the prospect is not something promising. He's been also to Mekelle, talking to TPLF leadership, reporting back to the African Union Peace and Security Council. President Obasanjo said that he now is unconditional conversation to begin to peacefully resolve the ongoing war, as I said, and all humanitarian services. So generally speaking, the international community is also there backing President Obasanjo. The United Nations is behind him. EU, the American, the U.S. top diplomat is also in town working with the African Union. Generally speaking, we can say that there is light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to resolving this conflict peacefully, Ram.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Girum Chala there, of course, live in Addis Ababa. Now, the CEO of South Africa's Estate Agencies Affairs Board says that the body is investigating allegations of racism in the property sector. This comes amid reports of aspiring tenants being denied access to rented accommodation because of their race. Here's Angela Coppola with that story.
Racism in the property sector was highlighted by a black tenant recently when he was told that a landlord wouldn't accept a black person as a lease or rental tenant. His social media post went viral. The estate agency board sprung into action.
He has brought a very critical issue to the fore that we think is merits a full investigation from the Estate Agency Affairs Board. And last week, I dispatched a team to Cape Town to speak not only to the complainant but to also speak to the agents.
Racism of any form is illegal in South Africa, and this includes taking mandates from landlords which exclude any race from renting or buying a property. The Estate Agency Board has the power to impose fines.
We have said that we are going to investigate the matter further, but it doesn't excuse the principal from liability, because they need to make sure that whoever reports under them, whether it's a full status agent or an intern, that person complies with the legal requirements of this, with the legal requirements of the laws of this country.
The incident has opened up a can of worms, and it appears from the public reaction to the tenants' posts that there's widespread racism in the rental property sector.
We made a decision that we're going to have public hearings, in terms of which people will be allowed to come to the EAB and to publicly come and speak about their experiences. Because in certain instances, it may not be as overt as was in the case of the gentleman in Cape Town, but there may be situations where there are undertones of this kind of behavior.
The investigation and hearings will also include industry operators and the associations that represent them.
So we're also going to ask them to come and account and explain why it is that their members would be perpetuating such a practice, and do they have any knowledge of such a practice? And if they don't have any knowledge of such a practice, then they need to join hands with us as the regulator to make sure that their members are educated and that any instances of such practices being undertaken are immediately reported.
Tenant racism is prevalent in Cape Town and Gauteng, and the investigation and hearings are a good first step to getting this matter dealt with. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, then we're still, of course, in South Africa. The country's finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, will deliver his first ever medium-term budget statement later this week on Thursday. Now, economists say that the minister, who took over from Tito Mboweni just a month after the devastating July unrest in KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng, will probably give more clarity on how South Africa's economic prospects have improved or not since the start of the year, and whether those potential gains can be used to cast a much wider social safety net. When he last updated the public on the condition of public finances back in February, when the main budget revenue was forecast to be around 25.3% of GDP in the 2021-2022 fiscal year. Since the 2020 budget review, however, which was delivered before COVID-19's absolute economic onslaught, the budget deficit has doubled and the in-year revenue shortfall was estimated at around $14.1 billion. All right, then, so what should we expect from the South African finance minister later this week? Let's explore that with Chris Hart, who joins us now live from Johannesburg. Chris, medium-term budgets usually don't have any major surprises, but these are, of course, pretty extraordinary times. What should we expect from Mr. Gonongwana?
It's going to be an interesting medium-term budget because, as you say, we normally look at the actual details in the February budget, but there's a lot of challenges that are facing the government at the moment. One of them, of course, is unemployment, and I think that's probably the national emergency. There's nothing else that's more important, and for that we need economic growth. On the other side, there's infrastructure spend that needs to take place. The country is in the midst of quite chronic load shedding at the moment, but there's also water problems, various infrastructure bottlenecks that need to be, and maintenance issues that need to be resolved. And at the same time, because of the high unemployment rate, there's the social needs that the government faces. And at the same time, during this COVID period, the government has really been spending like a drunken sailor, in terms of that, and the actual debt to GDP ratio is now climbing, well above 80% now, and it'll be interesting to see how the government and the finance minister balances all these things, the need to actually restrain the growth in the debt to GDP numbers. We are heading for what's been commonly termed as the fiscal cliff, and possibly a debt trap as a whole, which of course needs to be quite. The government's financing needs are quite considerable. They've started to resort to offshore funding, which of course in the long term is going to create problems because the government doesn't have a source of foreign exchange to service the debt that they're generating offshore. Which means that it's a burden on the private sector that's going to come through in the foreign exchange market, over the next few years, an increasing burden. And so really these are the things that they've got to balance, and we have to deal with the unemployment rate.
So back in February, though, the Treasury also said that it aims to slash the fiscal deficit to under 1% by fiscal 23-24, which is relatively close. It's basically just 2 or 3 years away. But given all the demands you're listing, on a relatively limited tax base, there's support for Eskom, there's all the social safety net demands. Can the country really hit that target?
I actually don't believe. I think, for instance, in the growth stakes, there's a lot of magic wand thinking. If you talk about growth, it might happen. To create growth, you have to take the throttles that have been put on the economy, and this has been developed over years with over-regulation and over-taxation. South Africa is simply not competitive enough at this stage to attract the investment that we need, or even the fiscal burden. The tax burden is too high to be able to generate the savings we need to fund the growth rate that we need. We need to bring the investment rate up, and we just don't have the savings in the system to actually do that. And that's really what, if the government wants to actually deal with the long-term growth problems and the unemployment problems, we actually need to see a regulatory relief, we need to see tax relief. And that is going to be exceptionally difficult to actually try and signal in that. And yet we have to do it. Otherwise we actually fall into an abyss that gets very, very hard to get out. Because at some stage, you cannot just continue spending on the social side, which is what I call the consumption side. We need to actually be tilting resources to the capital formation side of the economy so that we've got the resources to do the investment that's needed to generate growth. Growth needs investment, and to bring new economic activity into existence, you need capital, you need investment, and that is something that the current situation is actually quite hostile to.
Right. So prices of various commodities this year have rebounded fairly strongly. Platinum prices up at least 22% in the spot market. Thermal coal prices, South Africa exports a fair bit of that, up to around $140 a tonne back in August. But has that then translated into a tax windfall for the Treasury?
There's been a bit of a tax windfall because mining has done well, and that's because commodities have been moving up in price. But what's also been quite clear is that the actual core of the tax base has weathered the COVID lockdown restrictions fairly well. Where the tax base is not that strong, which is in your lower paid workers and your small medium enterprises, which is a struggling sector, those sectors have actually borne the brunt of the COVID lockdown restrictions. In other words, what they've had to endure uncompensated costs to actually try and carry it. We're seeing the decimation in the small medium enterprises, and we're also seeing it translate into higher unemployment rates. And basically we need to actually see very, very strong concerted efforts to actually get the SME sector back to a state of health. And that will need things like regulatory relief and maybe even tax relief, tax holidays for startups. That type of thing needs to be considered. And it's a pragmatism. You can't tax something that doesn't exist. We need to actually encourage things to come into existence to actually help strengthen the tax base in the longer term in any case. We hope that type of pragmatism comes through in the thinking, because if it's not in the thinking, anything else is wishful thinking, and we've seen too much of that in the past several years.
All right, and it ties up neatly with my next question, because the revenue estimate for fiscal 2021 was around 1.36 trillion rand, roughly 90 billion or so dollars, if my math is right. But we're seeing pandemic restrictions being slowly rolled back. Given that,
yes,
is a country on course to hit that revenue target?
They'll probably hit the revenue target. The problem is not so much the so-called revenue. I prefer to call it the tax take. It's the expenditure side that's been running ahead. So if you have a look at the actual track record of government, and in the medium-term budgets, they will always say the deficit has been rising, but we will have it under control in the next 3 years. Now, if you have a look over the last 10 years, we've been trying to get this deficit under control for the last 10 years, and each time it's pushed out and pushed out and pushed out. So instead of debt to GDP ratio peaking at 45%, we now don't have a peak even at 85%. And that's basically the medium-term budget needs a strong level of credibility to get the projections back to being believable again. That I think is a problem, is that there's a loss of credibility when it looks like fiscal control, when we talk fiscal control, but the fiscal control is not there. And I don't think there's the political will to actually bring that fiscal deficit under control.
Right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Chris Hart in Johannesburg. Of course, I should point out, we'll bring you coverage of the medium-term budget statement when it does happen later this week on Thursday. For now, I'll run through some company headlines. Let's start with Equity Group. The bank says it will launch, or rather has launched, a $4.5 billion loan program designed to help small and medium-sized enterprises to recover from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. The group CEO, James Mwangi, said that Equity will dedicate the funds to businesses over the next 5 years. The bank posted an 85% rise in 9-month pre-tax earnings, sending its stock up more than 4% to 52 shillings per share in trading today. Telkom expects to list its mast and towers business on the Johannesburg stock market by March 2022 as part of its ongoing strategy to unlock value. Telkom owns SwiftNet, operates around 6,225 cell phone masts and towers, and it is South Africa's largest independently run tower portfolio. Telecom announced its plans to list the business back in September. It's expected to take place in the fourth quarter of its financial year, which ends in March. A report that measures the quality of calls and data services in the third quarter of 2021 revealed that Vodafone came in first and Orange came in last in Egypt. The report on the performance of Egypt's network service providers prepared by the National Telecommunications Regulatory Body covers some 81 cities and districts. Egypt's oldest telecommunications company, Orange, had some pretty poor performance in 44 areas regarding the quality of calls and data services. And Nissan Motor Company has raised its full-year operating profit outlook by 20%. As sales are rebounding from a pandemic slump and tight supplies of vehicles allowed it to lower incentive payments and boost margins. Nissan, like other big global car makers, has been compelled to cut output because of a shortage of semiconductors and other critical components. But demand for cars in key markets like China and the United States is growing relatively strongly. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. Authorities in Zimbabwe are considering introducing Bitcoin to help solve the country's currency crisis. And Tunisia's Energy Forum is looking at the impact of fuel price hikes on the state budget deficit.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head over to Zimbabwe. The government over there is reportedly mulling over the potential adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender alongside the Zimbabwean dollar. Sources there say that discussions on legalizing Bitcoin payments are underway with the private sector players. But the government has some fears, mainly that cryptocurrency might be exploited by some market actors to facilitate more practices like money laundering or other illegal activities with little chance of it being traced. Suggestions have been invited by individuals and companies under the private sector to participate in finalizing ideas around the adoption of Bitcoin in Zimbabwe. Just last month, Zimbabwe's leading industrialists warned that the country's currency is in danger of collapse as businesses are resorting to using the US dollar for day-to-day transactions. Tanzania's central bank has been taking some measures to try and stabilize the banking industry over there, including merging small banks with inadequate capital bases. Non-performing loans in Tanzania stood at 9.4% of total loans back in March. That's nearly twice the target threshold of 5%. The proportion of bad loans stood at 10.5% back in March 2020, in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Bank of Tanzania said its investigations had found that some employees of some banks and financial bodies were directly responsible, in its words, for issuing loans without following proper procedures, fraud or other practices that essentially tantamount to a lack of integrity. End of quote. Now, the bank said, among other measures, commercial banks will be required to take legal action against such employees, and the regulator will blacklist and prevent them from ever working in the financial sector in Tanzania. Let's head up north now. Tunisia must invest in renewable energy sources as the world navigates its way out of using fossil fuels. These are some of the ideas coming out of the Forum on Governance in the Energy Sector, which the country is hosting in its capital, Tunis. The forum is also looking at the impact of fuel price hikes on the state budget deficit. CGTN's Adin Chouati is there.
The National Company of Oil Distribution says prices of energy products in Tunisia are increasing while access to the distribution market remains under license.
The import of fuel is monopolized by one state-owned company. This situation causes distortions that affect both the state budget, the purchasing power of citizens, and an increase in factor costs for Tunisian companies, while the cost of investment is very high. The reality of the national and international markets is different from domestic oil prices.
Energy experts at the Syndicate Chamber of Oil Distribution Companies know that the Tunisian energy market is not attractive compared to other African countries similar to Tunisia, which are not hydrocarbon producers.
Tunisia's energy market is 100% administered by the state, not only at the price level but also at the margins. The margins are around $25 per cubic meter, while the country that comes next is at $45 and around $150 in Morocco. Despite Tunisia's potential in terms of infrastructure and margins, we are ranked almost last in terms of foreign investment because our market is not attractive.
According to the Ministry of Energy and Mines, 97% of Tunisia's electricity is generated from fossil fuels, mainly natural gas. Only 3% of Tunisia's electricity is generated from renewables, including hydroelectric, solar and wind energy.
Tunisia has set a target to meet its 30% of electricity needs from renewables by 2030 and produce 3,800 megawatts. We started with 500 megawatts from renewables. This is the first step to achieve the national objective of improving the energy mix and reducing the high cost of hydrocarbons.
The Tunisian government has announced that after a delay of several months, the first photovoltaic power plant in Tozeur, southern Tunisia, is finally operational. Its official inauguration will take place in early 2022. Tunisia's oil and gas production covers less than 40% of its needs. The difference is covered by imports. The unpredictability of fuel prices at the international level weighs in on the state budget. The 2021 budget was drafted on the basis of $45 for a barrel of oil, while the current price is over $80. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Bar owners in Uganda want the government there to reconsider its decision to fully reopen the economy in January 2022. They want that brought forward to December this year instead. Now, they're worried that if the planned reopening takes place in early next year, they're going to miss out on the opportunity of making money in the coming festive season. CGTN's Hilary Ayesiga has that report.
Empty chairs and shelves are all that is left at Asylum Bar and Lounge. This is one of the major entertainment hotspots in the capital, Kampala. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 in Uganda in March 2020, no major activity has taken place here.
We had just opened 3 months. We opened in December 2019. Then in March, we went into a lockdown. From then on, we've been closed. So it's been hard.
The Ugandan government says it will fully reopen the economy in January next year. But this could be too late for entrepreneurs like Mugisha, who are hoping to cash in on the festive season.
It's unfortunate that he couldn't let us, come back slowly in December. He would have put a few, restrictions like observing SOPs and all that, so that in December we start slowly, because Ugandans naturally go out in December.
While restaurants are allowed to operate, bars are not. Bar owners want the government to allow them to open and practice the recommended World Health guidelines, such as washing hands frequently with soap, wearing masks, and social distance. This bar has been closed for nearly 2 years because of the pandemic restrictions. The management here has now decided to transform a section of the bar into a restaurant to keep their business afloat. Diversifying could be a solution for now as they wait for the government response. But the Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni insists that reopening bars before January may not happen until at least 12 million people are vaccinated.
All these must be fully vaccinated by the end of December. sought to open schools and the rest of the economy by January. It is now possible to do this. Resume full throttle activities of life and economy with rational safety.
According to a recent survey by Uganda Brewers Limited, a beer manufacturing company in Uganda, there are over 150 bar owners in the Kampala metropolitan area. The bar owners are hoping that if more people are vaccinated, the government could consider opening them sooner so that they can resume business. Hilary Yisga, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
New analysis shows that despite all the pledges we've been hearing at the climate summit, COP26, the world is still nowhere near where it should be as far as limiting a global temperature rise on average. Now, the findings show that the world is still heading for at least 2.4 degrees of warming on average, and that's far more than the 1.5 degree limit that nations committed themselves to achieving. The Glasgow summit is being seen as absolutely crucial to curbing climate change, but this prediction we're seeing now contrasts sharply with the optimism at the UN meeting last week, following a series of big announcements that included a vow to stop deforestation. COP26 wraps up this week. The report by the Climate Action Tracker looks at all the promises made by governments before and during the event, and it concludes that in 2030, greenhouse gas emissions will warm the planet will still be twice as high as necessary for keeping the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. On to Nigeria now. The high prices of liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, has forced many a street food vendor to turn to biomass, usually wood or charcoal, for their cooking. CGTN's Lindy Mtungana has that story.
Nigerians have been lining up to buy Aduni Abdul's black-eyed peas steamed in leaves for more than a decade. 5 years ago, a campaign aiming to improve public health made Aduni ditch using wood and charcoal to cook the delicacy. But the high prices for smokeless liquid petroleum gas, also known as LPG, forced her to turn back to using it in her cook stand.
Gas is costly. That is why I'm using firewood. If I don't use it, I will not be able to cook and sell to feed my family. I know charcoal causes illnesses. The smoke normally causes chest pain, but since there is no alternative, I have to use it.
Burning LPG emits around 50% less carbon than charcoal and 20% less than heating oil. And switching to the gas is a central plank of carbon reduction plans in Nigeria. LPG prices have, however, risen by 60% over the past year in the country, making it unaffordable for the average Nigerian.
They've been flaring gas in this country for years now, decades. And we need this gas for cooking. But you see, they don't want to invest in liquefying the natural gas and purifying it for domestic use.
According to the International Energy Agency, Nigeria's LPG use has been growing quickly. But in 2018, only about 5% of Nigerians used LPG for cooking. 73% relied on charcoal or biomass like wood.
People now come more to charcoal. Because I can even recall when one of my customers were saying gas is more expensive now, that we should be packing more charcoal because he's coming to buy more charcoal because he can't afford the gas.
Despite having extensive gas reserves, Nigeria lacks the infrastructure to exploit much of it. The country burns about 400 million cubic feet of gas as waste every year. Lindy Mtongana, CGTN.
Now, at the UN climate meeting in Glasgow, world leaders are pushing for a lot more innovation in the use of clean energy around the world. The Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says his government's new electric vehicle strategy will help the country achieve net zero emissions by 2050. But critics are saying this plan lacks details or any clear incentives to actually help Australian motorists to make the switch. Greg Navarro has the details.
The government has billed its $250 million Australian dollar plan as a future fuels investment fund designed to enhance consumer choice when it comes to electric vehicles. Critics contend what's most noticeable about this plan is what's not in it. There is no government incentive or tax support to encourage people to switch to cleaner vehicles, and it does not include a minimum emission standard for all new cars sold. Now, Australia lags behind many countries when it comes to electric vehicle use. In fact, it would only account for less than 1% of all new car sales last year here in Australia. That's compared to about 15% in the UK and nearly 80% in Norway. Lack of choice is a big problem. To give you an example, there are more than 100 more options available to consumers in the UK than there are here in Australia, and they are hugely expensive, limiting who can afford to buy one here in Australia. Prime Minister Scott Morrison says his plan puts the choice of owning an electric vehicle into the hands of consumers.
We're not going to tell them what to buy. We're not going to tell them where to drive or where they can't drive. We're not going to tell them how to live their lives and interfere in the way of life that they have. We're not going to put their petrol prices up to make them buy electric vehicles or do anything like that. Australians will make their own choices, and we're going to facilitate those by putting in place the infrastructure that enables them to make those choices into the future.
The government once again is fitting a familiar pattern. They deny a problem exists. They, during the last campaign, said that electric vehicles would end the weekend, and now in the pre-caretaker mode that this government is in the lead up to an election campaign, they want you to believe that now electric vehicles are all okay and they want to encourage its uptake.
The government's plan includes partnering with private enterprise to roll out about 50,000 charging and hydrogen stations across the country. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. Finance ministers from across the EU meet to discuss inflation and rising energy costs. And Bitcoin and Ethereum are recording peaks in Asia as enthusiasm for cryptocurrency adoption and fears of inflation rise.
Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time, Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, and trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
back to the program. Let's run through some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. Starting in Ethiopia, more than a dozen Ethiopian staffers working for the United Nations have been arrested in Addis Ababa in raids carried out under a state of emergency declared on the 2nd of November. A UN spokesperson says that the UN had submitted a request to Ethiopia's foreign ministry to immediately release those detained in Addis Ababa. There was no immediate comment by the Ethiopian government, which has been battling forces from the northern Tigray region for about a year now. Sierra Leone's health facilities are struggling to deal with the survivors of Friday's tanker explosion. Authorities fear that blood donations will soon run out as medical needs increase by the day. There is an urgent appeal for donations to treat more than 100 burn victims admitted to hospitals at the moment. And finally, the African continent has more than 8.5 million COVID-19 cases and over 200,000 deaths attributed to that virus. According to the Africa Center for Disease Control, the central part of Africa has some 207,000 infections and 3,900 deaths. West Africa, 665,000 cases, 10,000 people have died due to COVID there. And the eastern end of the continent, there are just over 23,000 deaths and 1.1 million confirmed cases. North Africa has 2.6 million infections and just over 71,000 deaths. And finally, Southern Africa has the highest caseload. Cases over there stand at 3.9 million and just over 111,000 deaths. That's a run through your headlines. Into the world of cryptocurrencies now. Bitcoin and Ethereum made record peaks in Asia as enthusiasm for crypto adoption and fears about inflation lent support to the asset class. Bitcoin rose as high as 67,803. Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency by market value, hit 4,825 in the early Asian hours of trading. Both have more than doubled since June, adding nearly 70% against the dollar since the start of October. Now, momentum has been gathering since last month's launch of a futures-based Bitcoin exchange-traded fund in the US raised expectations of flow-driven gains. In recent weeks, Australia's largest bank has also said it will offer crypto trading to retail clients. Authorities in Singapore have also sounded pretty positive about the asset class, and spillovers from a positive mood in stocks has also lent a bit of support. EU finance ministers are meeting to discuss inflation and rising energy costs. Here's Giles Gibson with the details from Brussels.
This is the Stockel market on the outskirts of the Belgian capital, where you can buy meat and cheese and fruit and vegetables. With inflation in the Eurozone now over 4%, prices for these everyday goods are rising. There's currently no lockdown like there was this time last year, but coronavirus case numbers here in Belgium are also increasing. This is all adding up to a sense of economic anxiety for the people at this market.
As the cost of everything is going up, we're forced to raise our prices at the same time. It's an endless cycle.
At the market, everything is a bit more expensive, but for me, it's not a disaster.
Now is the time to intervene with price controls or in the form of state aid to help the situation, because it's just going to get worse and worse.
The main driver of this rise in inflation has been this dramatic surge in energy prices that's been hitting economies all over the world. Inflation just for energy in the Eurozone in October hit 23.5%, and that of course means higher electricity and gas bills for people at this market, but it also means that prices for things like food are also being pushed up. EU finance ministers meeting just a few miles away from here are discussing the, quote, policy implications of all of this. But so far, the EU has left it up to national governments to respond to this winter's energy crisis. Giles Gibson, CGTN, Brussels.
Now then, visitors from the UK are now able to travel across the Atlantic to the US for the first time in nearly 2 years. The border reopened at about 5:01 GMT, and the first flight took off from Heathrow at around 8:51. All UK visitors over 18 have to prove that they have been vaccinated in order to get access to the United States. American travellers have been able to get into the UK since the 28th of July. Here's CGTN's Jim Spellman with that report.
After more than a year and a half, fully vaccinated travelers from the UK, Europe, China, India, Brazil, and other countries will be allowed to enter the United States.
Excited. It's been a long time, so I think mostly relieved that we have a like concrete date, so very happy.
Travelers must provide proof they've been vaccinated with a jab approved by the U.S. FDA or the WHO. China's vaccines from Sinovac and Sinopharm are on the list, but the Sputnik V vaccine developed in Russia is not. Travelers must also have a negative COVID-19 test taken within 3 days of travel.
We've just been waiting with bated breath, and then suddenly the announcement came, and yeah, so happy to be getting back to it. For me, it's my first time to the US, so really excited.
There are a few exemptions. Children under 18 don't need to be vaccinated, but nearly everyone else will have to meet these standards. Airlines say there is pent-up demand.
So when the Biden administration announced that the U.S. border will be open, we saw a 600% increase.
The Biden administration has been working directly with airlines to prepare for the rush of passengers. Still, travelers should be prepared for long lines at customs and immigration here in the United States. But many say it's worth it, including Faiza Ramon, who came to Dulles Airport outside Washington to meet her nephew.
He doesn't have a father. My brother died when he was a year and a half, and I'm practically his mother.
The wait goes on, and then the reunion.
You're on camera.
You can call on FaceTime and stuff like this, but personally, yeah, it's better.
And for travelers like Rukia Shaka, it's been way too long away from that special someone. Tell me what you're going to do.
See friends and family, actually. Oh my god, we're going to be on TV. Stop. I missed you too. Yeah, so this is the reason I came here.
A reunion
Yes.
worth the wait, but one they hope they never have to repeat again. Jim Spellman, CGTN, at Dulles Airport outside Washington.
Leading processor manufacturers from South Korea and other parts of the world have complied with the U.S. government demand to hand over their semiconductor production data. The U.S. Department of Commerce threatened to invoke the Defense Production Act if these firms did not meet a November 8th deadline to produce that data. Jack Barton has the details from Seoul.
We know they were essentially asked to provide everything, including trade secrets, including areas that are covered under confidentiality agreements with clients. So sort of industrial espionage with a hammer is the way some analysts are seeing it here. What SK Hynix has told us is that they have handed over information. They have also handed over information in the sort of sensitive area of inventories, but they've given basic inventories without detailing it down to the products, but they haven't handed over client lists. Samsung also saying they haven't handed over client lists and they haven't handed over inventories either. So, you know, we're still going to have to wait and see if that's going to be enough for the US. They've already sort of stated that it's not going to be, but whether if these companies can ramp up enough semiconductors to sort of take some of those bottlenecks out of the supply chain and keep Washington happy, or whether the Commerce Secretary over there, Gina Raimondo, who made the threat against the countries, is going to have to pull out a bigger tool from her toolbox that she mentioned to threaten the Korean firms with to hand over all their data.
Let's turn our attention to the 4th China International Import Expo. It's currently underway in Shanghai. Over 100 sideline events were held on the penultimate day of the event. During the event, over 60 exhibitors released 100 new products and services. Countries along the Belt and Road initiatives also received a large number of orders. The CIIE has also set up a new platform designed to promote exports from the least developed countries into the Chinese market. 90 companies from these countries joined this year's event. Now, the CIIE is, as we mentioned, in its 5th day, just a bit more to go. The medical pavilion has been seeing agreements being signed there virtually every other hour. We spoke to several purchasers who inked deals at that event. Here's what they had to say.
We have about 70 different products, of which 20 are brand new products this year. We will sign more than a dozen different agreements with our key partners. Bring this technology into the markets so that it can advance the 2030 Healthy China goals much faster.
Yes, we just signed an agreement with MindRay, which is a leading Chinese publicly traded company in the medical device space, to bring our FlowTrack critical care technology to more Chinese patients.
This technology is in urgent need for Chinese customers.
We Mindray need their support for our core technologies. This collaboration can greatly improve our competitiveness.
We have signed 10 collaboration agreements in this CIIE together with this innovative local company in their scientific area. We jointly pool our resources and expertise to expedite all this research development.
The Double 11 Shopping Festival. It's called that because it happens on the 11th day of the 11th month of the year. It's China's annual online shopping bonanza, and it's already pretty much underway. Designer toys, apparently, are among the most sought-after products by young Chinese consumers. CGTN's Xiaobing went to South China's Guangdong province to take a look at how toy manufacturers are preparing for this colossal shopping event.
The peak day of China's Double 11 Shopping Festival is yet to come, but designer toy factories in Dongguan are already busy. The 400 square meter warehouse of designer brand Toy City is packed with boxes of art-themed toys. The brand, established in 2020, took in only about 8,000 yuan or $1,250 during last year's Double 11 festival. It's forecasting more than 40 million yuan, more than $6 million in sales this year.
We expect 100 to 120,000 orders for this year's Double 11 Shopping Festival, which means we need to send out 10 to 12,000 packages a day. But day and night shifts combined, we can only handle 7 to 8,000 orders a day now, so we had to hire some temporary workers.
Part of this year's promotion efforts also included the company's release of several new toys, many of them in the form of mystery boxes or blind boxes. Entrepreneurs are optimistic about the industry, as collectible toys are gaining popularity among Chinese youngsters. Data from iMedia Research shows that the market size of China's designer toys reached 29.48 billion yuan in 2020, and with a growth rate of more than 30%. Is expected to rise to 38.43 billion yuan in 2021. Entrepreneurs are salivating over the prospects of this niche market. Statistics from iMedia show the number of registered companies reached 250 in 2020. Dongguan, the once renowned world toy factory with nearly 1/3 of Barbie toys produced here, now has gradually become the city of designer toys. Many OEM factories are starting up their own brands here and expect to expand their market reach through the annual online shopping frenzy. Cao Bing, CGTN.
All right, then a quick update on the commodity side of life. Oil prices rose on both sides of the Atlantic today. Brent crude is up about 0.4%, 83.79 a barrel. WTI crude rose by about twice as much, 82.74. Now, at those levels, WTI futures, in fact, have gone up by over 70% so far this year. The price rises did come ahead of the Energy Information Administration short-term energy outlook. That's due later today. Coffee futures are also trending higher today, up about 0.9% at 16.18 GMT to around $204.35. Uganda and Ethiopia, those are Africa's top two producers. They're both expecting record output this year, rising by as much as 22% in Uganda's case to over 630,000 tons of fine Arabica beans. Here's what's coming up next. We'll show you how a growing love for polo is breathing life into Nigeria's leather industry.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climate and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
I've been Shirushi, Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. The sport of polo has gained a fair bit of traction in Nigeria over the last 10 years. And with that rise in interest comes a rise in the need for accessories like boots and knee guards. Local manufacturers are now tapping into the country's leather industry, particularly up north, to make these accessories for the domestic and the export market. CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam has that story on Grassroots.
These are some of the finished products at 828, a leather crafting outlet in Nigeria's northwest Kaduna State. Kasim Abdul Salam Baba established the business 6 years ago, making shoes, wallets, belts and other leather accessories. The graduate of mathematics delved into making polo boots 2 years ago after identifying a high demand for it.
There was a huge gap because you can imagine getting a polo boot you have to send to as far as Argentina for it to be made, like the time, the duration it's been made, the distance, the cost and everything. So it was a huge gap in the market, and we saw that and we took that challenge. Almost 80 to 75% of the polo players in the north already knows about our brand, and since then they stopped patronizing the Argentine boots and started patronizing us.
Nigeria is one of the highest producers of leather and finished leather products in Africa. So Kasim sources all raw materials for his production locally. A pair of his boots sells for between $200 and $450. Now he's empowered over 120 people.
To impact knowledge, see how we can grow the economy in our own little way by providing job, see how we can expand to other countries. We've been doing training as part of our CSR to also build the society and bridge that gap of craftsmanship.
Since I started working here, I had a lot of experience because my boss would teach me a lot of things. Anywhere I go today, I can make a shoe, even if they aren't patterned. I know how to get a pattern for a shoe.
Nigeria's leather export stands at about $272 million, with the highest patronage from countries like Italy, Spain, India, South Asia and China. But lack of skilled manpower, weak infrastructure and poor funding continue to hamper growth. The Nigerian Economic Summit Group, NESG, projects that the nation's leather industry can generate over $1 billion by 2025. With support from government, local manufacturers like Kasim hope to make African leather brands earn a global spot. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Kaduna, Nigeria.
All right, then a quick update as far as currencies are concerned. Not much movement in the African currencies that we track here against American dollar. Cryptocurrencies do continue their rebound, however. Bitcoin at around 66,82293, just after 1630 GMT. Essentially, it's taken its rise this year to around 300%. Ethereum has also largely followed suit, up about 0.3% at that same point in time, just under $4,800. Its year-to-date rise is closer to 550%. Staggering numbers, whichever way you look at it. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. Many ways to get your feedback back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. World Today's up next from Washington, D.C.